Well, my name is Yuri Sergeyev. I'm senior fellow of Macmillan Center and the former ambassador of Ukraine to the United Nations. I have a privilege today to host and to introduce my good friend and brilliant politician and diplomat, Ambassador Maged Abdelaziz. Ambassador had a brilliant career, both domestically and internationally. Well, if you look at his CV, he was, well, the personal diplomatic advisor to President Mubarak for 7 years, and today I will challenge him about that period. To explain, most probably at the carpet or on something you are going to share with us. I do understand that you are an acting diplomat. It's much more limited for you than for me to speak on something. But so it will be interesting for the public, well, to share with us on that period of time, because you was a Sherpa, the organizer of different talks on the Israeli-Palestinian issue, Middle East settlement, the Arab U.S. dialogue, so it would be very much of our interest. So Ambassador Abdelaziz was permanent representative of his country to the United Nations. And it was a brilliant period for him and for the United Nations because he stood behind the major decisions. If you know something about peace building process, so he stood behind of the creation of peace building commission and whatever around that. Well, after that he was invited by the Secretary General Ban Ki-moon to be his deputy under Secretary General for Africa. So it will be interesting for us also to hear from him about the developments in Africa. And now, well, we have a privilege to welcome Ambassador Abdelaziz as the ambassador and observer representative of the League of Arab States. Most probably one of the most vulnerable regions in the world, where a lot of conflicts are going on. Syria, Yemen, Israeli-Palestinian, and many, many others. So, well, of course, we will be interested in Ambassador's vision on the developments in the region of Arab states, both on the whole region covered by the Arab states and the sub-regional level, because we know that there are sub-regional organizations like Maghreb, like the Gulf country council in the Persian Gulf. So all of them, they are part of the big Arab world. And of course, the title I invited Ambassador well to share about the Arab League in the world order. Nobody knows what the new world order is going to be. And it will be interesting to hear the vision of Ambassador on the new world order and the role of the Arab world in that world order. I will come back after the statement, the presentation by Ambassador, with my question, and then I will ask you to raise your questions. I have a list of the provoking questions to him today, and I guess that Ambassador is ready for that. Ambassador, you have a floor.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador Sergeyev. And I would like to start here by expressing deep appreciation to the Yale Macmillan Center for inviting me to make this presentation within its global governance series. And to thank in particular my dear friend and longtime colleague, His Excellency Ambassador Yuri Sergeyev, for this eloquent introduction. Thank you very much. Actually, when Ambassador Sergeyev invited me to come to Yale University on the 31st of October, I thought I was invited to a Halloween party. But, and maybe this is still the case, but after all, but I promise that I will not say anything here that's scary to you during my presentation or in the question and answer. As someone who has been associated with various aspects of the work of the United Nations for more than 20 years of my diplomatic career, 15 of them on national capacity representing an Arab, Muslim, non-aligned country, Egypt, and 5 years leading the United Nations Secretariat work in Africa, and now representing the League of Arab States in the United Nations for more than 1 year. I will try to put all my experience in national, regional, and international multilateral frameworks to assess and address the role that the League of Arab States is playing in the new world order. I believe that you have at least the basic information about the League of Arab States, which I will refer to later in some occasions as LAS, as it is the abbreviation LAS, so we call it LAS. Its inception and evolvement as a regional player in the international scene, particularly its participation as observer since 1950 in the activities of the United Nations General Assembly, Security Council, and the Economic and Social Council and their subsidiary bodies and intergovernmental negotiating structures. The Arab world today remains a region blessed with a plethora of unharnessed opportunities and enormous economic potential, and at the same time burdened by unprecedented political transformations and social challenges. The conflicts in Palestine, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Yemen, and elsewhere have all had regional implications far beyond their borders. And the upheavals and intrastate conflicts that followed the so-called the Arab Spring have, according to the United Nations, resulted in a net loss over $614 billion in economic activity in the region between the years 2011 and 2015. Fiscal expenditures that would otherwise have been invested in industry, in infrastructure, and education have been diverted to meet the pressing social demands and immediate humanitarian needs of populations throughout the region. Multiple Arab governments also find themselves compelled to allocate even more resources to combat the dual threat of terrorism and violent extremism, destabilizing their countries. And the overall situation in the Middle East has been further exacerbated by successive foreign interventions and interference in the internal affairs of the Arab world. The restoration of peace and stability, achieving the desired good governance and inordinate task of reconstruction in these multiple emergency situations will thus require an equally extraordinary political commitment on the part of the international community and the sustained engagement and support of our partners abroad. Only then can the Arab world truly realize its full potential and focus its resources on securing its uninterrupted development and sustained economic growth. While these multiple challenges may seem, at the moment at least, insurmountable, they do not represent an accurate characterization of the Arab world, which remains for the most part formidable in its resilience, highly confident in its economic potential, and strongly anchored by the innovation of its people. With a combined GDP of over $3 trillion, a population of more than 400 million, a total workforce exceeding 130 million, 55% of the world proven oil reserve, and foreign currency reserves exceeding 1.5 trillion US dollars. The Arab world is undoubtedly an integral component and exponentially important player in the global economy. The region is also by far the world's largest exporter of energy. It sits astride the global most important strategic waterways. Some of its countries enjoy the world's highest per capita incomes. Its airlines now dominate the global aviation industry. Its sovereign wealth funds are among the world's largest and most dynamic. It will be the host both of the World Expo in 2020 and the World Cup in 2022. And its economy is forecast to grow by 3.1% this year, with the World Bank estimating that a number of Arab countries will register a solid growth rate between 4 and 7% in 2018. There are many more aggregate indicators that one can mention, but let me just reflect on 3 specific examples that perhaps best illustrate how the Arab world, despite the challenges and preoccupations I referred to, is evolving, adapting, and preparing for the future. The first is in Egypt, which recently embarked on a massive infrastructure project to expand and develop the Suez Canal and its adjacent corridor, with the aim of positioning itself as an international hub for global maritime trade and transportation. The second one is in Saudi Arabia, which recently unveiled an ambitious plan to develop a new mega city on the Red Sea, powered solely by clean energy, called NEOM, and with total investments approaching $500 billion. And the third is in the United Arab Emirates, where the government recently established a ministry of artificial intelligence and announced its country-wide strategy for artificial intelligence, with the aim of placing the UAE at the forefront of the global revolution in technology and innovation. These 3 examples showcase how the Arab world, its leadership, and its societies are endeavoring to remain competitive in an increasingly globalized world. They demonstrate how the Arab world is strategically leveraging the opportunities afforded by globalization to further develop and diversify its economies. And they illustrate just how intrinsically integrated the Arab world has become in today's global economy and technological landscape. On the other hand, and judging from my long UN experience, particularly with the United Nations Security Council in the 80s and the 90s and the 2000s, it becomes all the more evident that contemporary international order is not anymore governed only by laws and by the principles upon which the United Nations was founded. It even appears to me that the rules of international law, international humanitarian law, and international human rights law are passing through a difficult period in our world order, a period that is preventing the implementation of some of its provisions in full, and in most cases casting heavy shadow over the interactive relation that should connect global good governance, which we aspire for in the United Nations, with regional good governance that we strive to establish at the regional level in our regional organizations, and with the good governance that both organizations call upon their member states to apply within their territories, while respecting fully their sovereignty and territorial integrity. The Arab world has been one of the most affected regions as a result of that gradual change in the world order. Simple comparison between the agenda of the United Nations Security Council in the 80s and its agenda in the 2000s will clearly reveal that in the 80s, about 80% of the issues before the Security Council were focused on African issues, on the Great Lakes region, on the Sahel region, on the Horn of Africa. Nowadays, about 65% of the issues before the Security Council are Arab issues, ranging from the question of Palestine through the situation in Iraq, in Libya, Yemen, Syria, Somalia, Comoros, and others, let alone issues like terrorism, violent extremism, fundamentalism, non-state actors, and lately the inter-Arab differences and disputes that does not appear in the United Nations, but continue to be dealt with one way or another among the countries concerned, and sometimes with the participation of the League of Arab States. One might ask whether this is a sign of failure of the collective security system by Arab states, and last, that had negative impacts on protecting and advancing various aspects of Arab nationalism, which has been the main objective behind the establishment of the League in 1945. One might also ask whether the constant change in checks and balances in the relations between superpowers, including its increasing interest in specific areas of the Arab region for strategic or financial objectives, had an impact on the current stage of affairs in the Arab world, or that the current state of affairs is merely a result of drastic changes within or between the Arab countries on the political, economic, or human rights aspects for further progress. There is no doubt that the New World Order had its impact on each and every country in the Arab world, but looking at the collective picture, we can identify several factors that might have increased the impact of the changes in the New World Order on governance both globally and in the Arab countries at large. This could include international and regional aspects. Looking at the international aspects first, and despite the continued successes in the implementation of many UN reforms, it is regrettable to see that the balance of power within the United Nations Security Council, the organ entrusted with the maintenance of international peace and security, is still based on post-World War II realities, without any hope for new permanent members with veto powers to be added to its membership in order to allow the representation of new political powers, including dedicating a permanent seat with veto power also to the 22 Arab countries as demanded by the League Summit. This in itself puts the Arab world increasingly under the mercy of the current permanent members, particularly in dealing with Arab issues that current permanent members themselves disagree upon, or at least have clear different interests or objectives in dealing with it, such as the issue of Palestine and Syria, which had been increasingly subjected to many vetoes to protect one party to the conflict or to support another, thus allowing those crisis situations to continue, spreading massive destruction and prolonging the humanitarian suffering of Arab populations on the ground. The conflict in Syria is a case at point. 7 years have lapsed since the eruption of the Syrian uprising in 2011. 3 special envoys of the most distinguished caliber have been appointed by the United Nations. But the persistent confrontation between the superpowers in the United Nations Security Council and the consecutive use or threat of use of veto is preventing the Security Council from reaching and implementing an effective and comprehensive peaceful solution, leaving the determination of what needs to be done in the hands of those who has physical military presence on the ground, including superpowers, neighboring countries, and others. But what is more troubling in this regard is that this confrontational mode in the Security Council is in part resulting in more isolation of the role of Arab countries and the League of Arab States in dealing with one of the most important issues of the Arab world. A closer look on the participation of Arab states in the negotiating tracks of the Syrian crisis will only show that meetings are being held with the participation of the United Nations within the Geneva II, Sochi, and the Astana tracks, and all those meetings are witnessing less and less participation from the League of Arab States and its member states. Someone might say that the League has chosen to suspend the membership of Syria from its membership, thus isolating itself from the process. Others might say that the lack of unified position among the Arab countries on how best to achieve the desired political settlement to the crisis after the uprising is preventing the League and its members from becoming an effective partner in the search for peace. But the fact still remains that the confrontation mode that is prevailing between the superpowers, in particular between the US and the rest of the E3 on one side and the Russian Federation on the other, is resulting in the current stagnation, which is only aggravating the humanitarian suffering of the Syrian people. The same situation applies in the Security Council's dealing with the question of Palestine and the future of the peace process in the Middle East. The lack of clarity regarding the components of the deal of the century, this deal that we keep hearing about for long, and its relation to the internationally recognized principles for decades, the two-state solution, the land for peace, and the Arab Peace Initiative, and the Oslo principles, the sanctity of the peace process under the auspices of the Quartet, with the United States playing the most significant role in dealing with the 5 final status issues: Jerusalem, refugees, settlement, water, and security. All this suffered a severe shock in the United Nations from the latest decisions by the American administration to recognize Jerusalem as a capital of Israel and to move the American embassy to Jerusalem. And the consequent decision to cut funding to UNRWA, the United Nations relief for the refugees, and other activities of the Palestinian authorities, putting the United States decisions directly into collision course with the international legitimacy on one hand, and with the Arab Peace Initiative adopted by the Arab League Summit in 2002 on another. This Arab Peace Initiative is stating clearly that all Arab countries are ready to recognize Israel, establish diplomatic relations with it, and normalize the relations when the independent and viable state of Palestine is established through free negotiations between the parties, with East Jerusalem as its capital. These sudden impact decisions by the American administration outside the scope of negotiations under the multilateral track were globally perceived as attempting to eliminate 2 of the final status issues, Jerusalem and the refugees, and resulted consequently in an unnecessary confrontation in the Security Council, which spilled over to the General Assembly. This confrontation could have been simply avoided through more clarity, consultations, and negotiations with the Palestinian Authority, the Arab countries, and the League of Arab States, about the strategy of the American administration in dealing with issues that are of paramount importance to the Arab world, and about the main components of the deal of the century that everybody is eagerly anticipating. What exacerbates the situation regarding the question of Palestine is that while we have just celebrated the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, and with the unanimous adoption of the 2005 outcome document of the General Assembly establishing new norms like responsibility to protect and like human security, to prevent the recurrence of the atrocities that were committed in Rwanda and Srebrenica, the global governance system in the United Nations Security Council has failed even to establish a monitoring mechanism that aims at providing protection for the Palestinian population from the attacks by the Israeli Defense Forces, while at the same time providing protection of the Israeli population from rockets and suicide attacks launched by Hamas. All that, and I am here citing only two examples, leave us in the United Nations with the impression that a new Cold War is brewing and having its negative impact on the global governance system, including its impact on Arab states. Yes, there is always the alternative to resort to the General Assembly as the parliament of the world under the famous resolution Uniting for Peace, but the open threats aired against member states who vote one way or another, and the threats to cut assistance or suspend activities made in official meetings and speeches before the Security Council and General Assembly are being only construed as threats to global governance system that could have severe implications on its credibility and effectiveness, particularly in regions such as the Middle East. Turning to the regional impact of New World Order on the Arab countries and the Arab League, the increasing international direction towards enhancing prevention in close coordination between the United Nations and regional and sub-regional organizations in accordance with Chapter 8 of the United Nations Charter should be looked at as a step towards the effective application of the cooperative global governance structure, aiming at dedicating more financial and human resources towards the effective implementations of the Sustainable Development Goals, targets, and indicators of the United Nations Global Agenda 2030, in close cooperation with its compatible regional and sub-regional plans and ambitions. But if we look into various regions of the world, we will find that different regions have different structures in doing so. In Africa, for instance, and I had the privilege to serve as Under-Secretary General of the United Nations and the Special Advisor of the Secretary General on Africa, one has to admit that the African continent came to realize this need for a new horizon much before the Arab world. The transformation of the Organization of the African Union, OAU, established in 1963, into the African Union, AU, in 2000, the establishment of the new Partnership for Africa's Development, the NEPAD, in 2002, as a blueprint for African development in political, economic, and social aspects, and the establishment of 2003 of the African Peer Review Mechanism, APRM, as an internal voluntary mechanism at the heads of state and government level aimed at reviewing good governance at the regional level, including democracy and respect for human rights. All those were preliminary steps towards the endorsement in 2015 at the 50th anniversary of the establishment of the OAU of the African Union's Agenda 2063. This is a huge agenda determining the African Sustainable Development Goals that will be implemented over for the next 50 years over 10 years tranches that constitute steps for implementation, and the priority regional projects necessary to achieve those goals. The most important element in this exercise is the principles that were established to guide these processes, which constitute an evolvement of the governance at the regional level, like moving from the principle of non-interference to the principle of non-indifference, thus allowing the AU and its sub-regional organizations to interfere in case of severe violations of human rights, just to mention as an example. In the Arab world, the Charter of the Arab League endorsed the principles of an Arab homeland while fully respecting the sovereignty of the member states, and established consensus as the basic rule for decision-making in its organs, thus allowing each individual member not to be bound by decisions that he or she did not agree to. This rule continues to exist, but in sharp contrast with consensus achieved through cohesion and mutual concessions as it is being done in the African Union. Many reasons have been cited, however, by scholars to strengthen the stagnant situation in the Arab world and its relation to the spread of conflict situation. First, is the sharp contrast in wealth between countries of the Arab region and the fear of some wealthy countries to be obliged to share their wealth with less fortunate states beyond the internationally agreed percentage in the United Nations development structure. Second, the many wars that our region passed through and the external alliances associated with it, including 1948, 1956, 67, 73, the Iran-Iraq War, the invasion of Iraq to Kuwait, Operation Desert Storm, the invasion of Iraq by the United States, the American bombardment of Libya, and lastly, the no-fly zone requested by the Arab League, resulting in a massive NATO operation on Libya until the 31st of October 2011. All these wars were associated with many alliances that were created by different Arab countries with different global and superpowers, which gave those allies some role, big or small, that should have been played by fellow Arab countries if the Arab collective security system was functioning well. Third is that the many failed efforts to unite at sub-regional level, or even as a portion of sub-region. Some scholars claim that the lack of sub-regional structures similar to that created by the African Union, such as the SADC in the south, ECOWAS in the west, IGAD in the east, and the East African Community also in the east, and others, is to blame. But let us always remember that Arab attempts have been made in this regard and failed in achieving its objective. The Arab Maghreb Union between Algeria, Libya, Mauritania, Morocco, and Tunisia was established in 1989, but now it can't be seen as an active partner neither in Africa nor in the Arab world. The same applies to the Gulf Cooperation Council, established in 1981 as a regional intergovernmental political and economic union consisting of all 6 Arab states in the Arabian Gulf. It made some significant strides and still making, despite increasing differences among its member states about the scope of cooperation and about how to fend the Iranian fierce campaign to interfere in the internal affairs of the GCC members, Gulf Cooperation Council, and the occupation by Iran of the 3 Emirati islands, and its continued pursuit of nuclear weapons. A quick analysis and comparison of the role that is being played by the African and the Arab sub-regional alliances and organizations would confirm that sub-regional alliances are important in shaping and implementing governance structures. Fourth, the deep sense of frustration in the Arab world about the lack of political horizon to settle the most acute problems in the region, the Palestinian question, the Syria, Libya, Yemen, Iraq, Somalia, and the different impacts that the continuation of these hotspots impose on different Arab countries, including on issues of borders management, refugees, migration, security, and many other aspects. This failing among Arab populations characterized by frustration and despair is only fueling fundamentalism, violent extremism, and feeding into a spread of terrorism. Fifth, the high uncertainty about the regional balance of powers following the aftermath of the 2003 U.S. invasion of Iraq and following the 2011 uprisings, with its negative social and economic impacts, particularly in the absence of clearly articulated criteria in this regard, resulting in many misunderstandings and sensitivities between countries of the region competing to play leading roles using financial means or political alliances or military might. Six, the skyrocketing arms import to the region, in sales for which the United States and its European allies are competing, which are linked in part to the fear of military confrontation with Iran on one hand, and to the failure to address the nuclear file of both Israel and Iran, including in the failure of the establishment of a nuclear weapon-free zone in the Middle East, despite a clear consensus that was agreed in 1995 Review and Extension Conference of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, NPT, and reconfirmed in the outcome of the 2000 and the 2010 review conferences. Seven, the sharp differences among Arab countries about how best to deal with terrorism, particularly when it involves actions to be taken against terrorists that belong to non-state actors and organizations that are utilizing religious or civilizational considerations to justify their terrorist activities. The lack of unified position in dealing with organizations such as Hamas, Jihad, Ansar Bayt al-Maqdis, the Muslim Brotherhood. Despite the vast contribution by Arab countries in the global fight against terrorism through the United Nations, there is particularly no Arab specialized structure or force to combat terrorism, including to cut its funding, to prevent foreign terrorist fighters, and to prevent any support to these organizations and actors. Ladies and gentlemen, having cited some and not all of the considerations that are surrounding any and affecting Arab good governance, I can only, and on the personal capacity, state that overcoming those factors is a daunting task for regional and international actors. Even in optimistic scenarios, progress towards de-escalation and stability in the Arab region is likely to be incremental, slow, and uneven. Nonetheless, there are concrete steps that regional and international actors can explore to mitigate the dangers of those conflict escalations. On top of those actors is the League of Arab States that is currently undergoing a very ambitious reform to enhance its ability to assist its member states in overcoming those hurdles and to coordinate their efforts within a framework that eliminates the underlying causes of conflict and coordinate the efforts by the Arab governments to address the challenges mentioned above and many others. But let us be clear. The reform and success of the League of Arab States will depend on how strong the support it will get from the governments of its member states, and on whether its secretariat would be allowed by member states to play its role in promoting creative ways and means to implement strategies and plans agreed upon by member states, and shaping new alliances to serve achieving the lofty objectives of the organizations. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope I did not over-expand in presenting these mixed pictures about the Arab League in the New World Order. There are many other things to be said, but let me conclude by saying that there is a lot of potential and a lot of capabilities in the Arab world, but the Arab world cannot do it alone. Partnerships are one essential part of our plans to succeed. And on top of it, our partnership with the United States. And I trust that with such strategic partnerships, we will be able to successfully achieve our objectives. Thank you, Mr. Moderator.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador Abdelaziz. Thank you for your comprehensive statement and sharing with us on your vision. And now, so I'm turning our meeting to the questions and answers. So I will not repeat my role as a mediator. I will put just one question, and then I will address the audience to address you. I have more questions than that.
Okay.
But based on your last sentence about the partnership, where the United States is one of the major players, and coming back to your role as the diplomatic advisor to President Mubarak, where you organize a lot of the meetings, both with different American ambassadors, different American presidents, Secretary of States, and the different players, both in Palestine and Israel. So Palestine was and remains one of the catalyst issues, not only for the Arab world, Middle East, but globally. And of course, if you like, to expand the explanation. So, all this process and all these actors who were there. Well, you started with Arafat, then you continued with President Abbas. You started with Bill Clinton, then continued with President Bush. The actors and decisions, where you feel was the best time to approach the any kind of the compromise, if ever. So could you briefly explain us what happened in the years when you were the advisor to Mubarak and the role of these players, including, as you said, the partners from the United States, which are crucial partners. And I will demonstrate some of the pictures of from that period. Well, President Peres, President Clinton, President Mubarak, President Yeltsin, President Arafat. So look, everybody giving hands with a vision that the solution is there. Well, President Mubarak, President Clinton, look, it gives us the imagination that, guys, we are close to the solution. Well, again, Arafat. Arafat was easy to communicate. Okay. Well, again, so we have President Abbas here. Well, and Netanyahu. So, look, the President Bush was so friendly with President Mubarak. This is not a picture relating to Africa.
These are pictures of the past.
Of the past, yeah. So, some of the agreements are being signed in Washington. Well, And you did that. So President Obama, President Bush, now President Trump, who met with the Arab leagues. So your your images from the past.
Okay.
Was it easy? Was it not? How the partners did? Well, to settle Israeli-Palestinian question, which is one of the crucial.
Well, thank you very much for that question. I hope you have time till tomorrow that I can answer. It is you touched on a very good period of the dealing with the Palestinian question. In those photos, you showed most of the photos with President Clinton, and actually President Clinton was one of the presidents of the United States that played a significant role and tried really hard to settle the Palestinian question. And I can testify that in his last 6 months of the presidency, he presented a very comprehensive plan. It was a 3 pages plan on the 5 core issues that I mentioned related to the settlement of the Palestinian question, and he invited the Israelis and the Palestinians to Camp David. Well, in that time it was called Camp David II summit, and it took place in 2000, sometime around the summer time. If my memory is serving me well, it was July or August in the summer. But at that time, the American administration decided that the participant will be limited only to Palestine and Israel. At the time, that Egypt and Jordan wanted to join these negotiations to be able to see firsthand and to participate in dealing in reaching the desired agreement. Why Egypt and Jordan? Because they were the only 2 countries that have diplomatic relations with Israel and that have already signed a peace agreement with Israel. But the American administration at that time saw that based on consultations with the sides, whereby of course the Palestinian side agreed to the participation of the 2 countries, but the Israeli side had some doubts about whether the participation is going to be helpful or whether the participation is going to make the Palestinian positions harder and was going to be like a backup to the Palestinian position vis-a-vis. So it was decided that this conference would take place only the 3 parties, United States, President Clinton, and President Arafat, and the Prime Minister of Israel at that time. And the conference discussed, and to our knowledge, the information that came out, and we were not participating, but the information that came out of that meeting was that there was agreement on 4 of the core issues, which are borders. There was agreement on issues related to the borders of the Palestinian state, on the cessation of settlement activities, on certain swap of land about the borders in order to ensure contiguity of land of the Palestinian new state. There was agreement on security, and the United States at that time, if I remember correctly, agreed to put some 4 or 5 hubs of military forces within the newly established Palestinian state in order to ensure that there is no military confrontation is going to be erupting between the 2 sides. And on water, they agreed on water. On refugees, they agreed on the return of a small number of refugees from outside, and on raising funds including from the United States, from the European Union, and from Arab countries in order to have those refugees settle in their new homelands. And
this agreement looks like a comprehensive solution. What happened to that after?
what happened was that there was no agreement on Jerusalem.
Okay.
So the only contentious issue that was remaining on the table at that time.
And the borders dated?
The borders were based on the borders of 1967.
Okay.
Not on the borders, as resolutions of the Security Council 242 and 338 and other resolutions are speaking about the borders of 1967, not the historical Palestine borders of 1948. But that was agreed. That was preliminary agreed. Of course, they were all working under the principle of nothing is agreed except when everything is agreed. That is the famous principle we used to have in the UN also, and we're still having. But the core issue that caused the differences was Jerusalem, because there were a proposal to divide the sovereignty over Jerusalem, the sovereignty over land, and sovereignty underground, and then because of the issue of the area surrounding the Haram Sharif and what they call, the Israelis call the Temple Mount. This area has levels. Mm-hmm. There is a land level, and then there is the underground level. So there were proposals related to dividing the sovereignty and then swapping the sovereignty between. So at that time, this negotiations collapsed. But as an attempt to salvage the process, President Clinton reached out to President Mubarak and to the King of Jordan and asked them to interfere. But both of them were reluctant to interfere because they said that we did not participate in the negotiations from its beginning, and we were not part of the agreement that have been reached regarding the other side. So it is better that you continue to deal with it on that particular level and at that particular track. And President Mubarak invited them to Sharm el-Sheikh and to Taba, and they came for a continuation of the negotiations, but that was almost in December 2000, when President Clinton was almost out, and so that didn't really lead any result. But let me say here, as you mentioned, leaders from all countries, also that Egypt is continuing now with its effort, and President Sisi as well is continuing with the effort to unify the Palestinian sides, the Palestinian front in Gaza with the Palestinian front in the West Bank, and to ensure that it is going to be only one Palestinian state. And that is taking a lot of effort and a lot of time from the leadership in Egypt, as well as from other Arab countries in support of, and from President Sisi himself personally, in support of the Palestinian cause in order to enter the negotiation at the unified front.
Thank you, Maged. So we know that Egypt tried to play a role as a mediator, helping the two states to find their solution. Some of the Arab states, they didn't like that, and Egypt was expelled from the League of Arab States for this activity. Well, for a durable period of time.
Yeah, that was in 1978 when we signed.
Yes, and you came back in
the agreement with Israel, and let me say here, as you mentioned this, that when Egypt signed the peace agreement with Israel in 1978, there were two agreements that were signed. One agreement was a peace treaty between Egypt and Israel, by which agreement Egypt would get back the occupied territory and would establish diplomatic relations and normalize with Israel. And the second one was the framework agreement on the establishment of a Palestinian independent state. And that framework agreement had the Palestinians decided to sign. It was establishing the independent Palestinian state after 3 years from 1978. It could have been. But despite that, of course, at that time, Iraq, President Saddam Hussein, Libya, and others led the opposition front, Syria, at that time, and so they accused Egypt of treason, and they even moved the headquarters of the League of Arab States from Egypt to Tunisia, and Egypt was suspended from the League of Arab States. But coming back to reality, they realized that this is the only. So had the Palestinians signed the 1978 second part of the peace agreement, the Palestinian state could have been in existence since 1981.
Well, so can you bring some optimism on this settlement of this crisis, which is civilization crisis, civilization conflict, but any hope that a solution could come soon?
Well, we are hopeful that the American administration is working really on a package of proposals, or on a deal of the century that we will be able to negotiate. But the Palestinian side is now refraining from engaging in the process because there are fears that after the decisions to move the embassy into Jerusalem and to suspend support for the Palestinian refugees, that what is coming, there are fears in the Palestinian side that what is coming could be worse, and that requires a quick and positive action from the American administration to come back to the basis and to the agreed principles of the international legitimacy regarding the peace process, and to resume. We are willing to resume negotiations anytime, but without touching on the basic principles that have been in existence, with the participation of everybody, including different American administrations before.
Okay. Two short questions. So you mentioned in your introductory the problem of terrorism. You were ambassador to the United Nations, and the audience doesn't know. The question is, being a member of the Security Council, Egypt was selected by P5, the permanent members, to chair the Anti-Terrorist Committee. It happened because of what? Egypt's experience, Egypt's active role in combating terrorism, because to get the support of 5 permanent representatives to chair the main committee within Security Council combating terrorism, it was something. Why it happened? Thanks to...
Well, thank you very much. I was not the ambassador of Egypt when it was selected to chair the terrorism committee.
But you brought to the Security Council through all your 10 or more activities. Well, so
no, I mean Egypt
and counterterrorism.
Exactly. Egypt had a very important initiative in 1981. And as you mentioned, President Mubarak, and brought his picture here, he made an initiative in 1981 in the European Parliament in Strasbourg, calling for international conference to deal with the issue of terrorism. Can you imagine that it has been since 1981? We are now in 2018. There is no international conference held on international terrorism.
On,
Why?
on annual base, the sixth committee, legal committee, I presided it 7 years ago.
Yeah.
We debated the same. There is no unanimity. Well, and still the resolutions, they are proposing to convene this international meeting proposed by President Mubarak in 1981. Wow.
Yeah. That is still an item.
Because still we do not have the definition what terrorism is.
Yeah, and that is because we failed to reach agreement on the comprehensive agreement of terrorism. In terrorism, there are 13 international agreements. And then the United Nations came to say that we need to have a comprehensive agreement on terrorism. But this agreement existed in 2 articles of this agreement, in Article 1 and in Article 16. I was in the 6th committee when it started and when it ended.
You know.
And we're both lawyers. So, Article 1 is the definition of terrorism, and throughout the negotiations, there was always the fear that we as Arab countries are trying to exempt the national liberation movements from being labeled as terrorists. At the time that we say that there is this clear distinction between national liberation movements on one side and terrorists on the other. The second is related to the status of forces that while they are combating terrorism, and whether forces that are combating terrorism could be responsible before the international criminal system for actions that are taken during that combat. Or not. So these 2 articles prevented that we have the comprehensive treaty. But then the United Nations shifted in 2005 and came up with a global United Nations strategy, counterterrorism strategy.
Yeah.
And this global strategy is being reviewed every 2 years. And more and more practical measures on how to deal with the issue of terrorism and how to address the terrorism based on the information that has been gathered during the last 2 years and the forthcoming direction that this issue is going. It is working well, but it does not address the situations that are on the ground. And when I'm saying that, Egypt now is in the middle of a strong battle with terrorism in Sinai Peninsula and against the Muslim Brotherhood and their supporters and against the Islamic fundamentalists. And that's why maybe also in the Security Council they took that into consideration along with other considerations.
Well, thank you, Ambassador. So I have, at this stage, my last question, and then I address the audience well to raise their questions. So, in your capacity as ambassador of a League of Arab States, well, the human rights. You mentioned in your introductory about the priority of human rights for the League of Arab States. So we know that the Muslim world, the Arab states, they adopted the Arab Charter of Human Rights. What is that? The alternative to Universal Declaration of Human Rights, or it is a complementarity to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights? Because a lot of the different interpretation of that stands. So different human rights for one part of the world and for another part of the world, or what is that?
No, it's not an alternative. It's not at all an alternative to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and it is within the application of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. You run into situations that you have to custom its implementation according to the characteristics and specificities of the culture of the society that you are addressing. And to address those human rights obligations that are coming in the declaration in a predominantly Muslim part of the world, you have to take into considerations other societal and other social and other intellectual aspects. So it is widening the scope and providing the interpretation and providing the supplementary provisions that would allow and facilitate the implementation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and other treaties like the Geneva Conventions, like other principles, the responsibility to protect human security. All those are also encompassed within this kind of treaty that is aimed at facilitating our adherence and our obligations in the international scene.
Thank you for that. It was just you who explained, because I knew the answer because I read the charter, Arab Charter of Human Rights, where in the preamble it is well written that respecting United Nations Charter and Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So it is said there. Well, so but I wanted you to explain. Thank you.
Thank you.
Please.
Yes, thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum. You articulated many challenges in Arab unity in the political sphere, and clearly there are. But how about spheres such as education, culture, communication, language, etc.? And also, are there any pending applications to the Arab League?
The second part, pending applications to the Arab League, no. There are no pending applications. I don't know what you're referring to. If you are referring to South Sudan did not apply for the membership of the League of Arab States. And are you referring to somebody else?
How about Chad? I heard rumors about Chad.
No, we did not receive an application from Chad yet. Yeah, maybe it's coming. Maybe you know better on this front. But on the issues of education and culture, there is an ECOSOC in the Arab League, an Economic and Social Council for the Arab countries that is very much specialized on economic and social issues, including all issues related to education and culture. And there are councils of ministers that meet 2 times a year on education, and ministers of culture meet two other times a year in the Arab League to discuss the common issues that are in the international arena. If there are any specific concerns or specific issue you would like to ask about, I would be more than happy to further elaborate.
Has it been successful, in your opinion, in those areas?
It is successful within the application of the international norms that are being decided collectively by the United Nations. For instance, what is happening in UNESCO, it's getting discussed, and we select what needs to be applied and what needs to be taken into consideration, and the Arab ministers sit down and draw action plans and put strategies, and countries implement, and then they come back with the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals, the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. I hope you heard about them. It's one of them is education, and all countries have to submit reports. We call it the VNRs, the Voluntary National Report, and to a meeting called the High-Level Political Forum. And there is going to be a summit level on the high-level political forum in 2020 where countries will present their reports on education. Because it is without education and healthcare, you cannot build a healthy society. And that is one of the strongest, so that education and culture are fully encompassed within the 17 Sustainable Development Goals that are going to be reviewed in the high-level political forum at the summit. There are some partial reviews happening every year at the ministerial level, but at the summit level in the year 2020.
Thank you. Other question, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ambassador. There are now, currently three major humanitarian crises within the Arab world. Yemen being one, one member of the League is basically besieging another member. And when you look at Gaza, Egypt could easily open the border and help the Gaza population. And the third one is, at least the Syrian civil war is nearing an end, a very unfortunate end, but at least what are the plans of the Arab League states regarding the Idlib province to help the humanitarian crisis in that region? So I'm just basically looking, yes, you have the Palestinian issue, you have all these very lofty goals, but what are you doing regarding the currently existing humanitarian crisis within the League?
We are part of a bigger organization, which is the United Nations. Of course, we attend all meetings of OCHA, of the Office of Humanitarian Assistance of the United Nations. We attend the pledging conferences that are being held with regard to all the conflicts that you mentioned, with regard to Yemen, with regard to Gaza, and to Gaza, for instance, on UNRWA. There have been a conference in the United Nations, and the gap that is resulting from the American withdrawal of 300 million US dollars that used to be paid every year has been almost covered by Arab countries. At the time that we are not responsible for the misery that the Palestinian people or that the Palestinian refugees are suffering. There are those who are responsible because of the Balfour Declaration, because of what actions have been taking action on the ground. But the Arab countries are doing their share in trying to mitigate the impacts of the humanitarian crisis. The same is applying also with regard to Yemen. And with the Syrian track, there has been many meetings that have been held in the UN, and many funds that have been contributed by Arab countries within the UN structures, because Arab League cannot deliver humanitarian assistance in Idlib. Those who can deliver is the United Nations apparatus of humanitarian assistance that is by law, it is protected, and by law it is capable of providing this humanitarian assistance. So rest assured that we are doing whatever we can do financially, even though we are not responsible. Maybe we are responsible in part because we did not do enough to settle it politically. But we are doing what we can do financially through the United Nations assistance system.
But how about exerting political pressure on Saudi Arabia stopping the war in Yemen? It's not only about money, but it's also making sure that there is an end to that war.
The Arab League, like the United Nations is an organization that is run by member states. So the secretariat and the representatives of the organization do not exert pressure on member states. The member states exert pressure on the secretariat, to be honest. And that's why it is coming. There are other partners outside the Arab League that are talking to those concerned about this issue, and I'm sure that this kind of international consultations on that will yield the desired results. That's what I can say.
Yeah, at least within the Security Council, these debates exactly focus on those who could diminish the problems there, including this the country you mentioned.
I get the ambassador's point.
Good.
I look just at his face. I know what kind of a dilemma he is in.
Yeah, thank you. Any other questions, please? You and then you.
Thank you for being with us, Ambassador. The Arab League has been coming to there's more scrutiny on the Arab League in terms of how much support it's been providing for many of the countries. And Abu Ghait and previously Amr Musa always claimed that they have a very limited budget in terms of how much they could spend. So to what extent do you think that's limiting the Arab League from conducting its operations in the Arab world? And then secondly, there's also been increasing scrutiny on the Arab League in terms of Al-Qawmiyya Al-Arabiya, like Arab nationalism, and in terms of how it's pushing for that. I'm just curious to hear your view on these 2 points.
Okay. Regarding the budget, yes, it is true that in order to run such an organization like the Arab League, you need to have the proper budget for this, for the activities of the league. There is a situation whereby budget does not get paid in full in the Arab League. And not even half the budget is paid in full. And we are now approaching, for instance, November of 2018. Less than half of the budget have been paid. But the Arab League Charter does not include any system or like the United Nations Charter. In the United Nations, if you don't pay the budget for one fiscal year, you get suspended from voting. So you go to press the button to vote, the button doesn't work. You press the button to speak, it doesn't work. You pay, you work. That is not prevented. As I was just answered the question, the Arab League is acting under the supervision and the sovereignty of its member states. It's like also the issue of the rule of consensus decision. Consensus in the United Nations means that we sit down and we agree to everybody gives and take, and then everybody stand high and then lower their demands, and then we reach an agreement and reach consensus. In the Arab League, consensus could be that we reach this level, but somebody decide that it is not going to be bound by it, and that is allowed in the system of the Arab League. So these are all things related to the reform process that is undergoing. I referred to it in my statement. They are considering, member states are considering all those aspects in the reform package that is being negotiated now in the League. It will take a couple of years, and I'm sure it will come out as much as you want to see.
Thank you. And the last question, we'll have a chance to communicate to the ambassador after that during the reception informally. So your final question.
Hello, Ambassador. So my question is, I think a main point of your talk was that it seems that the Arab world needs a lot of assistance from the outside countries and partnerships with other nations. But be interested to know what you believe an ideal partnership it would be. What would these Arab states get from these partnerships? What sort of actions would occur? due to these partnerships within these nations. And then my second question would be, I guess, how do you feel about, Arab states seeming to require help from other nations to resolve some of these issues, and not, I guess, being able to do it on their own?
So the first question is receiving assistance from outside?
Yes. What would these states get from these partnerships? I believe was your closing statements, you said through partnerships they will achieve their goals.
Yeah. Let me start with the second one, with the partnerships. The Arab world has a lot, as I mentioned at the beginning,
Yes.
has a lot of resources and a lot of funds and a lot of potential. And what we want the partnership for is a partnership for progress and for the future.
Okay.
It is not that we are asking for handouts from anybody. We are not asking for financial assistance. Maybe some members will ask for financial assistance, but that is being dealt with because, in the Arab League, we have almost 9 countries out of the 22 are members of the African Union, and the rest are not. And it is just happening that those that are members of the African Union are the less fortunate countries, and including Somalia, Comoros, Mauritania, and others that might need financial assistance. So they get the financial assistance through other channels, through the United Nations, through the African Union, and sometimes through voluntary contributions from the rich Arab countries that include in their strategic plans assistance to other less fortunate countries. So, but partnership should be divided into political partnership,
Okay.
meaning of mutual interests, not only fulfilling interests of one side,
Okay.
and not domination by one side.
Okay.
If you know what I mean.
Yeah.
And this is on air, so I'm not going to say it. And so this is what the partnership we're looking for. Partnership among equals.
Okay.
Partnership towards political progress, toward economic progress, towards social progress.
Okay.
That is for both sides.
Of course.
Okay, so that's one. And the other one is funding. It is as I said in answering the question of the budget, it should be funded. Activities of the Arab League should be funded. When I came first to work for the Arab League, I was struck to know that the budget of the Arab League is $60 million per year. When I was Under Secretary General in the United Nations, I was running African affairs. I had alone under my, and I wouldn't say how much, but more than half of this budget as a special sector that is working within a global organization. With all the GDP and with all the funds and the sovereign wealth funds that we are having here. So reform of these issues is very important.
Okay.
And I trust that it will yield the desired result.
Well, let me on behalf to thank Ambassador Abdelaziz for being today with us, and he's open to continue the informal.
Anytime.
Thank you. Thank you indeed.